On August 1st, the global trading system will enter a new phase of volatility as the United States enacts a sweeping round of tariffs targeting some of its largest and oldest economic partners. A 30% import duty on goods from Mexico and the European Union. A 35% levy on Canadian products. A doubling of existing tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper, now set to reach an unprecedented 50%. These measures, authorized under emergency economic powers, will affect an estimated $2.3 trillion worth of U.S. imports, over 70% of the country's entire inbound goods trade. This is not just another episode in the Trump administration's long-standing trade war playbook. It is a deliberate and expansive reset of U.S. commercial policy, a signal that multilateral consensus has been sidelined in favor of unilateral pressure. And it's happening at a time when the global economy is already navigating persistent inflationary pressures, fragmented supply chains, and mounting geopolitical competition. The stakes are enormous. Mexico is currently the United States' top trading partner, with over 80% of Mexican exports heading north. The EU, particularly manufacturing giants like Germany, remains a critical supplier of industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, and high-value components. And Canada is the leading source of U.S. steel and aluminum, as well as a major provider of energy and critical minerals. These tariff threats are triggering a cascade of countermeasures as foreign governments scramble to protect their economies. At the same time, multinationals are revisiting their cross-border investments, calculating how to hedge against new cost structures, disrupted inputs, and regulatory uncertainty. This is a pivot point, not only for trade volumes, but for the long-term architecture of global production networks. Will the world revert to isolated regional blocs? Will retaliatory tariffs fuel inflation and choke GDP growth? Or will this bluff turn into another paused gambit in a negotiation cycle defined by brinksmanship? To answer that, we need to dissect the data, trace the legal mechanisms, and understand the systemic consequences playing out behind the headlines. Because what happens on August 1st won't just reshape spreadsheets, it will redraw the borders of the global industrial map. The United States is reigniting a confrontational trade doctrine that hasn't been seen in scale or intensity since the post-war industrial restructuring of the 1940s. Since returning to office, President Trump has unleashed a flurry of over 20 tariff directives aimed at key economic allies and rivals alike, including Mexico, Canada, the European Union, Japan, and China. These are not symbolic measures. They are wide-ranging, sectoral, and coordinated to impact the very arteries of the global supply chain. As of mid-2025, nearly 71% of all U.S. goods imports, representing over $2.3 trillion in value, are either currently subject to new tariffs or are in the direct line of pending ones. This includes materials critical to U.S. infrastructure like steel and aluminum, advanced components like semiconductors and auto parts, and essential goods such as pharmaceuticals and industrial chemicals. If the full schedule of tariffs proceeds without judicial or legislative interruption, the U.S. effective tariff rate, how much the country actually collects as a percentage of total imports, will rise from just 2.8% in 2017 to a projected 11.6% by the end of 2025. That would mark the highest level since 1943, when wartime protectionism and industrial mobilization dominated policy. This is not protectionism as a negotiating tactic. It is protectionism as a structural policy designed to rewire trade flows, reshore manufacturing, and shift leverage in favor of U.S.-based production. The scale of the policy shift places immense pressure not just on bilateral partners, but on the multilateral system itself. The World Trade Organization, already sidelined in major enforcement actions, has yet to formulate a coherent response. In the meantime, countries are pursuing asymmetric retaliation, localized industrial policy, and a growing reliance on regional trade blocs to insulate themselves from Washington's unpredictability. What makes this moment so consequential is the convergence of multiple crises: inflationary pressures within the United States, global post-pandemic supply chain fragility, and the rising weaponization of trade as an extension of national security doctrine. The cumulative effect is not merely a surge in duties or headline-generating announcements. It is a fundamental reconsideration of how, where, and by whom the world's goods are made and moved. The global framework is shifting from integration to insulation, and the numbers are making that shift impossible to ignore. Steel and aluminum are once again at the center of a seismic shift in U.S. trade strategy. The Trump administration has now raised tariffs on these foundational industrial inputs to 50% for nearly every nation except the United Kingdom. This marks a doubling of the existing rate and eliminates many of the country-specific exemptions that had previously buffered allies. The justification, framed under national security via Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, is the same legal tool used in Trump's first term to initiate what would become a sweeping transformation of global metals trade. The reaction from key trading partners has been immediate and calibrated. Canada, the United States' largest supplier of both steel and aluminum, has responded with a combination of retaliatory tariffs and a tightening of its own import quotas. The Canadian government is capping the entry of steel from non-free trade partners like China and Turkey to half of their 2024 levels and imposing a matching 50% tariff on any imports beyond that quota. Canada is also expanding these measures to steel from trade partners who do have agreements, excluding the US and Mexico, if volumes surpass a newly established ceiling. These adjustments are aimed at protecting Canada's domestic steel industry, which relies on imports for nearly 2/3 of its consumption, compared to less than 1/3 in the US and 1/6 in the European Union. The impact on industrial output is already visible. According to Catherine Cobden, president of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, domestic steel production dropped by 30% in May alone, just weeks after the initial 25% tariff announcement. With the new 50% rate now in effect, further contraction is not just expected, it is imminent. Cobden's warning reflects the sentiment across the industry. While these countermeasures may blunt the impact of foreign dumping, they are insufficient to compensate for the collapse in US-bound exports, particularly in high-value rolled and structural steel segments. In the automotive sector, the implications are even more far-reaching. The US has now applied a blanket 25% tariff on all foreign autos and parts, with one crucial exception: vehicles that meet USMCA content thresholds are exempt. This carve-out has preserved intra-North American trade in the short term, but for companies operating across multiple continents, the calculus is shifting. British vehicles are allowed a quota of 100,000 units annually at a reduced 10% rate. Anything beyond that threshold is subject to the full 25%. This quota, while symbolically significant, is practically limiting for UK automakers who rely heavily on US market access. Major automakers, including Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis, have already begun to reevaluate their capital expenditure plans. Several investment freezes and project delays have been quietly announced as companies navigate the uncertainty surrounding cross-border parts flows and potential cost surges. The structure of modern vehicle manufacturing, where a single car might incorporate components sourced from 5 countries across 3 continents, makes the system highly sensitive to even marginal disruptions. A 25% tariff on imported transmissions, for example, not only raises the sticker price of a finished vehicle, but also destabilizes supplier contracts and production timelines across the entire network. Outside of heavy industry and transport, high-technology sectors are now facing their own confrontation with trade policy. On February 18th, President Trump announced new tariffs on semiconductors and pharmaceutical imports, starting at 25% and with an open threat of going much higher. Less than 5 months later, the pharmaceutical sector was hit with a proposed 200% tariff. Copper, another critical input for everything from electronics to renewable energy infrastructure, will be subject to a 50% duty beginning August 1. Together, these measures target approximately $47 billion in annual imports, according to U.S. trade data from 2024. The response from industry has been alarmed, particularly in pharmaceuticals. The sector, which already faces regulatory pressures, thin margins, and complex global supply chains, warns of a healthcare inflation ripple. Most active pharmaceutical ingredients are produced overseas, particularly in China and India. A 200% tariff on imported generics or API inputs would not only raise prices for U.S. patients, but potentially destabilize hospital procurement budgets and lead to shortages in critical care drugs. For semiconductors, the consequences are more opaque but no less significant. While the U.S. is investing heavily in reshoring chip fabrication through the CHIPS and Science Act, global foundries in Taiwan, South Korea, and Europe still supply the overwhelming majority of advanced chips used in everything from smartphones to fighter jets. A tariff on those imports could slow innovation, raise costs for downstream manufacturers, and push some firms to relocate assembly operations outside the U.S. entirely. In isolation, any one of these sector-specific tariffs would be significant. Taken together, they represent a systemic attempt to reshape the cost structure of entire industries. But the longer-term consequence is more strategic, a signal to global producers that the U.S. market, once a pillar of stability in the global trading system, is now subject to abrupt, unilateral shifts in trade policy. And that, more than any tariff percentage, is the new price of doing business in America. The cumulative economic effects of these sweeping tariffs are now measurable in clear macroeconomic terms, and they extend far beyond the realm of trade balances or diplomatic soundbites. According to models from the Congressional Budget Office, the Tax Foundation, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the aggregate impact on U.S. GDP is expected to be a contraction of 0.8% by 2026. While that figure may appear modest in isolation, within the context of an already slow-growing post-pandemic economy, it represents the equivalent of erasing tens of billions of dollars in output annually, enough to derail entire state budgets or stall critical infrastructure projects. For American households, the consequences are even more immediate. As tariffs filter through the economy in the form of higher prices for consumer goods, intermediary inputs, and industrial materials, they manifest as a de facto tax increase. In 2025 alone, the average U.S. household is projected to face an additional financial burden of $1,296 directly attributed to tariff-induced price inflation. By 2026, that figure climbs to $1,683 per household. And this is not a targeted tax on luxury goods or discretionary income, it's a regressive squeeze, felt most acutely in essential items, vehicles, home appliances, electronics, and prescription medication. Market income, the aggregate wages, capital gains, and investment returns across the U.S. economy, is projected to decline by 1.4%. This erosion is not merely theoretical. It reflects depressed hiring in trade-dependent industries, diminished profits across consumer-facing sectors, and slower wage growth for millions of workers in logistics, manufacturing, and retail. The labor market may not crater overnight, but it will calcify, especially in export-heavy regions already under fiscal strain. Ironically, while these tariffs were promoted under the banner of economic nationalism and fiscal revitalization, the immediate result is the single largest tax hike in over 3 decades. In 2025 alone, the U.S. federal government is set to collect $171.1 billion in additional revenue from tariffs. That figure represents 0.56% of GDP and exceeds the total tax increases enacted by any administration since 1993. It is larger than the hikes implemented under Presidents Obama or George H.W. Bush and occurs without formal congressional approval, relying instead on executive authority and emergency declarations. However, what the government gains in revenue, it risks losing in price stability. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and semiconductors have a direct pass-through effect on the prices of finished goods. Cars become more expensive, appliances rise in cost, home construction slows as raw materials costs spike. And in the pharmaceutical industry, where over 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported, patients face higher drug costs and potentially tighter supply as U.S. firms reevaluate procurement strategies. International retaliation compounds these pressures. Canada has announced 25% tariffs on $86.7 billion worth of U.S. exports and is weighing an electricity export tax from Ontario, measures designed to inflict political and economic pressure on U.S. constituencies. China, after an initial escalation to 125% tariffs on U.S. exports, has entered a 90-day cooling period following a tentative deal, but that pause is fragile and heavily conditional. The European Union, for its part, has prepared €21 billion in countermeasures, set to activate immediately if negotiations fail before the August 1 deadline. These retaliatory steps are not symbolic. They are targeted, deliberate, and backed by legal authority under WTO dispute frameworks and reciprocal clauses embedded in bilateral trade agreements. The structural consequences are starting to crystallize. Highly integrated supply chains, especially in automotive manufacturing, are beginning to fragment. A single car assembled in Detroit may depend on steel from Ontario, wiring harnesses from Mexico City, and electronics from Bavaria. Tariff walls force companies to either absorb punitive costs or reconstruct supply chains across more expensive geographies, often with diminished efficiency. The pharmaceutical sector faces similar disruptions. With most inputs manufactured in China and India, U.S. drug makers are scrambling to identify alternative suppliers or negotiate new price floors. Meanwhile, semiconductor production, a sector already stretched thin by post-pandemic demand, is caught in a web of export controls, retaliatory blockades, and rising raw material costs, threatening everything from defense electronics to consumer devices. Taken together, these developments suggest not a short-term trade dispute, but a long-term reordering of how global commerce is structured. The model of hyper-efficient, globally distributed manufacturing, once hailed as the cornerstone of modern economic integration, is now being replaced by a system marked by redundancy, regionalization, and risk hedging. In the short run, this means higher prices. In the long run, it may mean a less dynamic, more protectionist world economy. As we look toward the August 1 implementation deadline and the critical July 31st federal court ruling on the legality of these tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the stakes are no longer abstract. What unfolds over these next weeks will either validate this policy direction or expose its legal fragility and economic vulnerability. For investors, manufacturers, and ordinary consumers alike, the signal is clear. Trade is no longer just a function of economics. It is a primary instrument of geopolitical strategy. And that brings us to the final question. Where does this all lead? If the courts uphold the emergency tariff powers, we could see an entrenched policy architecture that prioritizes domestic production at the expense of cost efficiency, competitiveness, and diplomatic trust. If the courts strike them down, we may enter a new phase of legislative gridlock, as Congress is forced to debate trade authority for the first time in a generation. Either way, the damage has already begun. Industries are recalibrating, foreign governments are retaliating, supply chains are shifting, and consumers are paying more. This is no longer a hypothetical conflict. It is a global reset in motion, one driven not by spreadsheets or ideology alone, but by hard accumulating pressure points across economies, institutions, and national interests. If you found this breakdown insightful, subscribe for more analytical deep dives into the economic forces shaping our world. And as always, stay informed, stay strategic, and follow the money.